Susan, I ask you to consider a hypothetical. Imagine that Stig Larsson is alive, and he's an unpublished American writer, and he's just finished the first Dragon Tattoo book. So the question is, how does he find an agent? And, you know, there must be, what, 3,000 agents in this country? How does he identify the 2 or 3 or a dozen who could bring that book, the beginning of a series, to all that it could be? I mean, he doesn't want just an agent.
Right, right. Well, the internet's been a wonderful thing for writers because it really gets out there who the agents are for things because of various articles being written or lists that are published. Back in the day, you had to really look in the acknowledgments page and see who was the agent. A lot of fiction doesn't have an acknowledgments page, so that makes it a little tougher. But it's great when writers do their homework. I mean, if a writer knows the kind of work I represent, then they should find me and not, somebody shouldn't be sending me Tom Clancy because I don't represent things like that. So,
just to add to that, I interviewed a lot of our debut novelists, and a lot of them said that they went through the process of reading the books by the writers they most admired who had just published debut novels and looking in the acknowledgments or doing the research online to find out who that person's agent was, someone they felt simpatico with or some connection to, and that was a way that they found people. Yes, to reinforce what you said. Yes.
Susan, how do publishers get an author's first story collection noticed? I mean, we hear a lot about platform, and in literary fiction, there really isn't one.
it's getting harder and harder, it really is. But Viking's doing a great job of finding, I think Krys has been doing a lot of radio. Radio is just a wonderful and sort of a great way to reach people. It's sort of a captive audience in their cars, and they're usually serious readers. And with something like Krys, a lot of publishers are attracted to fiction that has a subject that would lend itself to some nonfiction articles. So the backdrop of Korea, and particularly right now with the regime change, or what's happening with defectors, it's a handle that a newspaper or a magazine article can latch onto, and then you can get the story discussed in that context.
Yes.
You, of course, as thank you. Of course, as you said, you cannot read all the submissions yourself. So you have assistants and interns. Now, I think the problem with this is they are typically very young people, just with a BA coming from college, and they may be brilliant, but they didn't have the time to gather some life experience and much less reading experience. Now, how are they up to when something comes a little bit more literary and that is based on...
Oh, it's the literary stuff that they're the best at because they're coming out of college, where they're reading the best of the best.
All right, but they do not have the time to read over a whole lifetime, or over many years, let's say. So, and
neither
they
do
also
I.
the first...
You're reading on vacation, are you? Can you say that?
But, I mean, so they are the first filter, no? So that may be a best thing for them.
Well, I tell my interns and my assistant to err on the side of positivity, because if we're too critical, we won't have anything to sell, and we live off commission, so we can't be too critical. And I'm sort of hard to read for because I have a particular sense of what will work that isn't necessarily like I said, so there can be some very well-crafted material, but that's not going to excite me, and something much rougher will. So I always say, if you think there's something here, if you think this is something that can be worked on to become something, send it to me, show it to me. But I have stacks and stacks, and it takes me a while to get to things, and people are like, it's been 4 months since you've had my manuscript. I'm like, really? It seems like 2 weeks. I don't know what to say. It's,
And I have to say, our first novel prize, we have all kinds of readers, but many of the readers' first tier readers in the past have been recent graduates of MFA programs, and many are readers in their 50s or 60s. And I find that, you know, the capacity to be surprised is a really nice thing in young readers, and to risk as readers. And so sometimes they really add something by just being young and adventurous in their reading.
I have to add to that as well, just having come from a program. I'm not actually, I'm older than I may appear, but I think mystery age, right? but there's a lot of people whose work I respected the most and admired who were in their 20s and were writing some very exciting things. I think that people, just because they're in their 20s, they come with 2 decades of experience, and depending on what those 2 decades look like,
Yeah, that's true.
they're going to be shaped.
It's true here. You had a question? Oh, wait, I think she was first.
Hi. I just wanted to ask, how long has your collaboration from the beginning to tonight, how long has that been?
Is that 2009?
I think it was 2010.
Oh.
No, was it 2009? It was the summer of 2009, probably.
Okay.
And we met. And we're actually returning to Squaw this summer.
Right.
As author and agent. So
Oh,
it's a
terrific.
very special
Right, and
triumph.
So is that a norm of 3 years to fruition, or is there such a thing as a norm?
There's no norm. There's
Okay,
no
because
norm.
I
Everything
have
is
no
different.
knowledge of that.
Yeah,
Just-
I've worked with some writers for years and many, many, many drafts before I go out with something. Yeah.
Fine, understand.
And some are just really quick. Wow, this is great. Let's sell it. Boom.
And we thought we'd be ready to sell earlier, but I was working on the novella you see at the end. It just kept growing on me that year between 2009 and 2010. It grew to about 180 pages, and I thought it was going to become a novel. And I thought, you know, I don't love it enough to stay with it this long because it felt like it was supposed to be shorter. And it worked better as a novella, so I lost 130 pages,
Right.
and then we were ready to go.
Right, right, right.
No, very interesting, looking forward to it.
I had a question for Krys. So did your novel spring from a short story that you were working on? Was that the birth of it, or is it something totally outside that? And I haven't read it in your collection yet, but I look forward to it.
Thank you. There is a story about defectors in the collection, but you know, that wasn't. It's almost a historical piece in a sense because it's taking place in the 90s during what's called the Arduous March, the hunger, the famine period. But the novel was more inspired by really my years of friendship with people and a kind of anger that their stories were being told, and I think often misrepresented, at least their experiences in the border area. And I had a couple of close friends who had asked me to write their story, you know. And a friend of mine who's a poet, he's a North Korean poet, I'm actually in the process of trying to teach him how to write fiction because I think he's a great writer. He's got a facility with language that I think is rare, and the educational background that gives him tools in a sense, because a lot of defectors are really struggling just to make ends meet and really make a living in South Korea. And he's in a special place where that's possible. But that really inspired the novel. There were stories that just needed to be told. And a lot of, I react a lot to injustices, and I think that there's a lot of people to be angry with in that world. And in a sense, in a novel, you can bring these people to the happier place of safety, the way that these defectors have found new homes around the world.
Yeah.
Hi. So Krys, I know you're a writer that exists in like 2 literary communities. You do work with authors in Korea. So you're also working kind of in 2 different languages, and I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how that influences your writing and what kind of influence you've gotten, you know, physically, or, you know, geographically from being in a different country as well as writing for an American audience.
I don't think I could have written these stories if I hadn't lived in Korea, I have to say. I think that the decade that I've lived in Korea, I've now spent half my life in the West and half of it in the East, if I count my early childhood. And I think that my sensibility and the perspective that I looked at Korea shifted over time. And also, of course, it's a great love for the country, but also a sense of coming back to the things that shaped both the immigrant communities in America and my family, and I think the sense of nationhood. That wouldn't have been possible without geography. I think geography changes everything. Places become a part of you. And there's a second question?
About language, working in 2 languages.
Oh, it's just very confusing in some ways. You know, and when I come back to the States for about 2 weeks, my sister says, yeah, you always have trouble speaking for a little while because you say things fine, but you say it in a way that's somehow Korean, like your manners as well. But it's the reverse as well. I go back to Korea and then I always feel so strange speaking Korean until I adapt. But you know, my day-to-day level is the same too. You're with a group of expat friends, and then next year with Koreans, next year with North Korean defectors who, again, not only their language, but their way of speaking to each other and to you is just different from South Koreans as well. So I'm always kind of moving between worlds and staying permanently
When you
confused.
go to write, are you writing in English, or do you find yourself writing in Korean?
Oh, I write in English. That's the language I studied in. It's the language that it's the only language I can write in. I love reading Korean writers and Korean poets as well. That's theirs. I will never ever read. I'm not a Nabokov. I wish I were, but
Yeah, yeah.
I want to ask you a question about the relationship between a writer and an agent, and probably will show you how little I know about the subject. I'm a fellow at the Writers Institute, and I'm Palestinian, but I live in Israel, and that's why I'm asking the question. Does the writer or does the agent at any level interfere with the politics of the writing? I'm saying that because I know from what you said about your novel is that it is a political novel at some level. And I have a novel that I have written, and I have a collection of stories that I have written, and it is very political, and I don't so far dare approach an agent even because of the politics of
I'm a big believer that you have to write what feels most important to you and really true, because if you don't, it shows on the page. The life disappears. I mean, when I started writing the books I did, I knew, well, we're certainly not going to sell in China, you know? And that's fine. That's, you know, I lose 1 billion plus readers, but that's important. Potential readers, of course. But I think that you have to say what's important, and eventually that will bring life to the work, and an agent who responds to the work is the best agent for you. I think I've been lucky in Susan because she's very respectful of what you want and need to write. There's been no pressure in what's best for a writing career. She's much more interested in what's exciting to you, because that's going to be exciting on the page. That's not always the case with every agent, and I do have friends who've had a lot of horror stories and not so pretty divorces, as I call them. But, and some writers will give in to that pressure, and others will say, no, that's not what I want, and will walk away. And I think it's important to find like a writer's agent, and I think that's what Susan is.
I'm going to take just one more question.
Yeah, I was wondering if you could address, kind of open-ended, any of your sense of your personal identity and background, and how that fits in with what you actually do on the page.
I think that the person I am is definitely reflected in the page, and both the preoccupations, the obsessive themes that I can't seem to get away from. You don't want to write about certain topics, but here it is again. As well as the geographies. I mean, I was raised here, was lucky enough to have gotten a good education through a scholarship, and that allowed me to go to England, and then went to Korea. And those 3 locales have been very important to me for different reasons. And I think that ends up coming back in both the collection and the novels. Again, if you stay true to who you are as a person, that doesn't mean write what you know in the most literal sense, in the narrow sense, but in the broader sense, I think that you will find yourself on the page whether you want to or not.